I'm going to be talking about the Manifesto for Joyful Observability in Ruby on Rails. What is the problem? The problem is our apps are too hard to understand in production. I've lost count of the number of Rails apps I have worked on that are just difficult to reason about. We don't know what's going on with background jobs. We can't understand how the website is working. When a customer comes to us and says, the website has just challenged me or denied me, or I get a weird screen, or I get an error message. We have no idea sometimes what is going on. And it takes us hours and hours and hours to dig through mounds and mounds of rubbish, of nonsense, to understand if we're lucky. If we're lucky. And so I'm here today to tell you about some ideas that I have evolved over the last 2.5 years to help with this. Let's get going. So the first one is we should have a few wide events rather than many narrow events. What do I mean by this? I mean that we should have very few events, call them logs if you wish, call them traces if you wish, that are extremely rich with data. So in a web app, you have a request and a response. That HTTP request response cycle should have between 1 and 5 events associated with it. Maybe a few more in edge cases, but mostly between 1 and 5 events. And each of those events should be rich with data. We should have hundreds, if not 1,000, different dimensions to that data. What IP address did they come from? What is the user agent of the person that hit the site? What's the IDs of domain objects that are related to that? What's the ID of the user? What's anything that we could possibly know about that journey that the user has been on? We should dump it in that event. The second principle is cultural over technical. There is a lot of temptation as programmers to obsess about what version of Postgres should we use, and should we be logging the exact SQL queries that we're making, and blah, 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 blah. And I'm not denying that we need to log some technical stuff. Obviously we do. You'd be crazy not to, but we would equally be crazy not to obsess about the cultural underpinnings of this practice. So we'll come on to domain versus technology in a few slides later. But really what I'm talking about here is cultural trumps technical. You can have all the technical chops in the world. You can understand how to do logging and events and observability and monitoring. But if nobody else in your team does, what's the point? So it needs to be a cultural change that the whole organization goes through. And that needs to go from looking at the logs and understanding how to use them through to understanding how to change the logs or change the traces or change the metrics, whichever ones you want to use. And it needs to be a holistic thing that we now just, it's a way we write software. It's built into our software writing process. It's not something we tag on at the end, or there's one expert in the organization who knows it all. Convention over configuration, anyone using Rails, this should be old hat, very familiar, except we don't do it with logging, do we? Everybody has their own unique little special snowflake way of doing it. I've seen as many implementations of logging as I have apps. And certainly when it comes to observability, there are loads of tools to use. Should we be using OpenTelemetry? Should we be inventing our own thing? How do we log domain objects? There's a lot of questions. And I don't think we have enough conventions around this kind of stuff. So that's partly what I am here to help with, is to start to move us forward in terms of conventions. OpenTelemetry have done a boatload of great work around what's the schema, how should events look, but now it's time to take it to the next level. Improvement over perfection. I struggle with perfection. I'm a perfectionist by nature, so I understand, I get it. Let's get everything right first time. No such thing in software. We all know that. We've all been down that road of it's going to be right this time. It's going to be perfect this time. It's a nonsense idea. It's never going to work. You have to learn, you have to get feedback, and you have to iterate. So let's start out with wherever you're at with observability, and let's inch our way forwards. What would we need to add to the app that would make us understand it better? We do that. We add that, whether it's a log, a trace, whatever it is. And now we're in a better place. Now we understand that actually we never really understood our app to begin with. And that opens a whole can of worms. And then we realize, oh, this area over here that we thought we understood, we don't really. So then we add some more instrumentation to that area. And so it goes. Domain versus technology. I've talked a little bit about this in previous slide, but we get hung up on the technology and we forget about the fact this software is designed to fulfill a business need. It's supposed to do something in the world. And that do something in the world isn't to update a Redis cluster or create a new background job. No customer in their right minds wants that. And certainly no business person cares about that. They care about invoices and customers and payments and services rendered. They care about timescales and projects and media. They care about adverts and they care about cars and they care about any service that you want to do with your web app. There are domain objects and there's a rich underpinning of these domain objects. And so let's log and monitor what's going on with these objects instead of over the technology. And not saying don't log and don't monitor and don't instrument things like Redis and Sidekick. That's of course really important, but we should be obsessed with the domain. And too often I see it the other way around. We've got lots of little log statements saying database updated, maybe not lots of log statements to do that, but you get what I mean. We've got tracing and instrumentation on SQL statements, on Redis when we've updated a cache key. Why don't we have any information about the objects that these operations are operating on? What's the subscription ID that it was operating on? What was the status of that subscription when that operation happened? What was the invoice ID? What was the customer ID? What was the user ID? Our logs and our instrumentation is often bereft of this. And so when it actually comes to asking intelligent questions about the app, we struggle, don't we? We really struggle. High cardinality versus low. What the heck is cardinality? It just means an ID, really. So prefer IDs over data like status, like attributes of the object, because the attributes will change over time. And we can get those, and we can grab those and stick them in the event if we think that's appropriate. And if we think that's useful, that's cool. But the ID is absolutely critical. And this is why metrics do not work, because that if you want a high cardinality thing logged alongside every metric, captured alongside every metric, guess what? You're going to have a new dimension for every single metric, and that gets really, really expensive really, really fast. Structured versus freeform. Let's employ structured logging. For goodness sake, let's employ structured logging. I read a lot of stuff on the internet that seems like structured logging, this kind of crazy new idea. It's been around for ages, and yet in the Rails community, we are still in our infancy when it comes to understanding how to do structured logging really well and in a really, really concrete, engaging way that means that we can query our data afterwards in an absolute heartbeat. What should the structured look like? What should the keys be? What should the values be? Should we be logging times? Should we be logging dates? There's a whole load of questions around this. Now, I believe the art has come forward a lot in the last few years. I've seen a lot of structured loggings pop up in the Rails space. Big shout out to Semantic Logger, which I think is probably one of the best ones, but we are still pretty weak in this area. Things are going to get better with Rails 8. Rails 8 has announced structured logging, which I'm incredibly excited about. Can't wait to see what the Rails core team do on that, but it's been missing for a long time. So let's not kid ourselves that logs are this series of text files. Oh, somebody did this on the app. Oh, somebody opened this window on the app. Just a bunch of single lines of plain text. That idea was dead and buried in the 60s, 70s, 80s. Our apps are way more complex now, and we need that structured logging and that rich data to really make sense of them and understand them. Implicit versus explicit. I know there's a lot of Ruby magic in the Ruby community, and it's a bit controversial sometimes, but I would far rather the domain logic be absolutely clear and the instrumentation code just kind of fade into the background. Now, sometimes that is just not possible. And in that case, our instrumentation code should be clean, well-structured, easy to read, and should have minimal interference with the business logic. And you should be able to write a new service, a new controller, a new action, and 90% of what you need is there. And you just add the little finishing touches to say, we're going to add this bit of context and this bit of context and this bit of context, and it'll all just work. Existing tooling versus new tooling. I know there are lots of up-and-coming observability tools, the most established of which is Honeycomb. I'm a huge fan of Honeycomb. I love what they're doing. They're trying something new. But if you're using Datadog, let's carry on using Datadog wherever possible. Migration is super expensive. And if you have to pay flipping a team of engineers for 3 months to get you off your old observability system onto a new one, what the heck is the point? You're not going to get those 3 months back in terms of savings, unless you are saving an absolute boatload of money. But the disruption to the team, in many cases, I don't think it's worth it. Stick with what you have, Datadog, Splunk, Kibana, whatever it is, and let's make that work as well as we can for you. This is not a perfect world. Let's not pretend we're in a perfect world. Let's be actually pragmatic about this. Automated versus manual. Pretty obvious, really. We shouldn't be doing manual instrumentation wherever possible. It should all be automated. We should have little scripts to create these things. We should have generators. We should have a scheme so that you can say to it, I need a subscription. And it'll say, okay, what's the bounded context for that subscription? And it'll say, okay, great, log these bits of data in this kind of context. And it's all nicely automated for us. We are not a set of monkeys on keyboards anymore. We have AI to help us. So let's make it automated to the greatest extent that we can. We're nearly there. Hang on. Awareness versus assumptions. Let's be actually aware of what's going on. This is the biggest one I see. We know the app's doing this. Oh, yeah? How do you know that? Well, because my friend used the app and it was fine for him. Oh, yeah. What about the other 1,000 people? Do we absolutely have the data to validate their experiences? And you'd be surprised at how often, when you start digging into these assumptions with logs and with traces, you start finding, that's not how I thought it worked at all. Oh, yeah, okay. This bit is what that's being fired before this other bit. Oh, that's impossible, surely. So let's be aware of what our app is doing. And then when something comes along, a major outage, bing, we hop into our tool. We're aware already of what's going on. We've got all of this rich data and bum, 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 we can pinpoint it within seconds, ideally minutes. This also comes to the cost. Let's actually be aware of how much this thing is flipping costing us. The number of times that I've pushed something to production and actually, oh, wow, it's caused a massive load of logs. Oh, sugar, now we've got our logging quota is completely full. Now we've been charged an overage cost. Nightmare, right? Let's be aware of how much it's costing us, what our run rate is, and let's be aware of how our app is acting in production. Exploration versus dashboards, maybe slightly controversial. I'm not a huge fan of dashboards. A dashboard to me is 16 ideas on one screen, and what happens? You get an overview of the system. Well, that's the theory. What actually happens for me, maybe just me, I go, oh, look at that. Oh, look at that. Oh, look. Oh, is it? Yeah, that's interesting. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. And then after 5 minutes of just clicking around and fiddling with stuff, I'm actually no nearer to an answer than I was before. Normally, I find I want a specific answer, and a dashboard is just super distracting. There's 16 different things all vying for my attention. It's supposed to give us an overview, occasionally the right thing. I'm not saying they're never the right thing to do. I'm not saying, but in my experience, they're more of a hindrance than a help. They're more of a distraction. So let's not bother making a dashboard for every single thing under the face of planet Earth. And let's make tools that we can explore with. I've found so much use in creating a simple graph or a simple chart and actually getting used to the tool, whether it's Datadog or Kibana, and actually understanding how it works so I can drill into this dimension, link it with this dimension. There was an incident recently with one of my clients, and within, I think, 5 to 10 minutes, we saw some really odd behavior with the app. Within 5 to 10 minutes, we pinned it down. It was somebody who just started at the company and they didn't really understand what they were doing, and then made all these changes in the WordPress section of the app, and we could see them log in. We could just see, oh, right, okay, so we've got this massive spike that's concentrated around this user ID. Oh, interesting. Filter out that user ID, see the massive spike on its own without any other noise. Oh, I see what they did. They did this, and then they did this, and then they did this, and that's what crashed the app. So that kind of exploration is absolutely critical and way more useful than dashboards in my experience. Predictable versus chaotic. Shouldn't need much explanation, but in the world of programming, things can get pretty chaotic when we're examining our app. So predictable costs, predictable app behavior in development. Let's aim for predictableness. And we can only do that by understanding it, and we can only understand it by instrumenting it and not knowing the questions that we need to ask before we're going to ask them. If the answer to your question is, we're going to add more logs, your observability has failed. You shouldn't ever have to say, we need to add more logs to really understand that. You should have all the logs you need, and it's an ongoing process. I get it. But let's make things predictable. Let's not make things so we have to push code to production to actually understand our systems. And that is everything. Thank you for your time and attention. You can direct any questions and feedback. I'd love your feedback on this. What did you like? What did you hate? What did you think resonated? What did you just, didn't think that made sense, you know? On Twitter, I'm Synaptic Mishap. On LinkedIn, I'm also Synaptic Mishap. My name is John Gallagher, and the website is joyfulprogramming.com. Remember the www, because at the moment, the Apex domain does not work. Sorry. So that's my newsletter, Joyful Programming. I will see you on the flip side. Over and out. Thank you.